Welcome to the Democracies College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students and P-20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu. In this episode, HyeJin Tina Yeo at OCCRL talks with Dr. OiYan Poon about racial justice among Asian Americans and the current attacks on affirmative action. Dr. Poon is an assistant professor of higher education leadership at Colorado State University.
It's a great pleasure to have you here, Dr. Poon, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Would you introduce yourself, who you are, and then what your current role is, and then can you describe your research to our listeners? What prompted you to research Asian American and affirmative action?
Sure. So my name is OiYan Poon, and I'm an assistant professor of higher education leadership at Colorado State University and the director of a new center called the RISE Center, which stands for Race and Intersectional Studies for Educational Equity. And my research is really focused on the racial politics of policies around college access, particularly about affirmative action and of course various other issues of race and racism that Asian Americans experience in higher education. So that's a little bit about my research. And what prompted me to research specifically Asian Americans and affirmative action is I can actually pinpoint a person who really got me to do this. Before I started graduate school at UCLA with Don Nakanishi, I was working at UC Davis in Asian American Studies as an academic advisor and working with underrepresented and first generation college students, and especially from Asian American backgrounds. And while I was there, I was also an admissions reader for the university there, and so got to really know how things work in the admissions process through a holistic review process, and started noticing the way the public talks about college access and admissions really is disconnected from how things actually work and operate. But I think admissions professionals and offices, they're kind of in a difficult position where they can't really talk to openly or directly about how things work because they don't want people like families or students to feel any more pressure to try to essentially game the system or be who they're not. And so it's this tricky place that I feel that admissions professionals and leaders are in. And at the same time, there's a lot of conversations about Asian Americans and assumptions that misperceptions, I think, that test scores are what really matters in admissions, is everything. But it's really not, nor should it be. Like, we shouldn't want to have a world that depends so heavily on test scores for a lot of reasons, and I can get into that a little bit later. But when I started graduate school with Don, I learned that he had been very active in the admissions debates in the 1980s, and in cases where there were universities in the 1980s that were actually actively limiting the numbers of Asian Americans being admitted to universities. And so Don was very active in that debate and that research, and he was constantly, as my advisor, just saying, you should research this, you should do this, you have the right background, you have the, and I would keep telling him, Don, that stuff is too hard, I don't want to do it. But just as I was about to graduate, there was a new proposal in the University of California that would open more access for students of all backgrounds, including Asian Americans, to be eligible for the University of California. And there were some people within the Asian American community that were very against the policy. And so Don asked me to do an analysis on the data and do a study to really understand what was going on. And he was very supportive of me and really pushed me to be out there. And I think in that way, he was a very challenging mentor. And in some ways, he always knew what I needed to do with my research. And I appreciate that about Don Nakanishi. And he passed away several years ago. So I hope that I'm kind of carrying on his legacy of work. And even before I knew that this is what I needed to be doing, he was the one who knew.
Yeah.
I
Now
needed to be
we
doing
appreciate him
yeah.
taking a lead onto you in this work. Yeah, and especially this time of the all the issues and regarding affirmative action.
Yeah, and he was just very special because he was also, I think, a lot of people, for the field of Asian American studies itself, he was a founding giant in that field. And so a lot of research across fields on Asian Americans, it comes from people like Dawn that started to lay the foundation. And so
there are many different views and stances on affirmative action. And can you explain what affirmative action is and how it's practiced in the United States, especially in college admissions? There are a lot of misconceptions.
Yeah,
about that,
definitely. So historically, affirmative action came out of the civil rights movement and the acknowledgement that the United States has essentially been founded on racism, particularly anti-Black racism and settler colonialism. And so during the civil rights movement in the 60s, the notion of affirmative action, even if you just break down the term affirmative action, it's about actively acting to affirm, right, values of racial equity and acknowledging that systems of racism and other oppressions like sexism and classism have been in place for centuries in this country, and that we as a nation need to act affirmatively to unravel and deconstruct these systemic inequalities. And so originally affirmative action, specifically in college admissions, was practiced in a way where in some universities, most famously at the UC Davis Medical School, in the Bakke case, there were set-aside slots for, in the UC Davis Medical School case, 4 spots for African Americans, 4 spots for Asian Americans, 4 spots for Native Americans, and 4 spots for Chicanos and Latinos. But that didn't necessarily mean that they were capped at 4 each, but that minimally each incoming class would have to be that. So now we know that kind of practice as called racial quotas. But that is no longer the case because in 1978, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Bakke, University of California Regents versus Bakke, that quotas were unconstitutional. So universities and colleges should not be practicing set-aside programs like that. Also, what's really important in that case is that it changed the rationale for using race-conscious admissions from one of, it used to be, right, we acknowledge that this country has been very racially discriminatory towards minority groups, so we should practice affirmative action and have race-conscious admissions. But in Bakke, the decision shifted it from what was called the remedial rationale to the rationale that we still have today, which is the diversity rationale. So it's okay now to practice race-conscious admissions using race as one of many factors, as long as the goal is to advance a racially diverse educational environment. And so that was initially established in 1978. And then in 2003, there were 2 Supreme Court cases in Michigan, the Grutter and the Gratz cases. And in those 2 cases, the Supreme Court again affirmed, yes, diversity is very important to accomplish. It is an important and valuable goal. That means that universities can use race as one of many, many factors, right? It's not the determining factor. So nobody can check off a box on that alone. That's how they're admitted. No way. And that's not okay. And in fact, in the Gratz case, the Supreme Court said providing extra points, a point preference for underrepresented minorities or anybody based on race is not okay. So that's unconstitutional. So I think that's 2 of the biggest myths out there about affirmative action is that it's a set-aside quota program, or that if you are an underrepresented minority, you get extra points or some kind of preference. But that's not how affirmative action works. Instead, as was discussed in the Grutter case by the Supreme Court, and then later in the 2016 Fisher case, holistic review was essentially affirmed as a best practice in admissions. And what that means is, like I said before, race cannot be a determining factor. It can be one of many factors, and every single individual applicant needs to be reviewed and understood. What is your story? What is that individual student's story? Who are they? Where are they coming from? What is their big picture, their whole story? Who are they as a whole human being?
Not just only focused on the SAT or ACT score. It's
Exactly.
Just we want to know more about you, how much you can contribute to
Exactly.
the diverse learning environment. That's a holistic review.
Exactly.
So, okay. Yeah.
Exactly. And it has to be holistic. It has to be beyond test scores and grades too, because if I was to say, 1240. What do you know about me?
Right. Yeah.
That was, by the way, my highest SAT score, right? So but you don't know much about who I am, how I might contribute within a classroom based on that number. And so it has to be a holistic picture. Also, just being like, oh, I see a Korean woman in front of me. That's not enough. That's not holistic review either. That's not, I don't understand. I don't know who you are just based on, hi, I'm
Korean.
yeah, like, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about you still. And so holistic review is understanding all of these things. And so that's the way affirmative action works today, is recognizing that we live in a very vastly unequal society and people are coming from different schools with different qualities and resources in those schools. Their family circumstances are different. Some people come from wealthier backgrounds, some people come from less resource backgrounds. Like, we can't just use one standard to measure all of this diversity. We have to understand each person for who they are and what they could bring to the environment. So that's what holistic review is. It's much more complicated. I think the other myth that exists is that people, as admissions readers, we just look at the profile and we're like, I like this person. I want this person. It also doesn't work like that. It's actually a very methodical, when it's a robust process, when it's a strong process, it's a very methodical, I would even say it kind of a qualitative research study.
Wow.
Because you're evaluating a lot of data points for each individual applicant to try to get a picture of who they might be on your campus.
So just to summarize, there's no racial quota, which is illegal, right?
That would be illegal.
So we don't have those racial quota, racial preference in affirmative action. And then also race could be just one factor that up to just examine the students' stories or to get to know individual.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's really the common belief is about those racial quota and then the preference.
Yeah, I think people think like you just check off a box.
Yes.
And it's like, you're in, it doesn't matter who you are. No, everything matters. That's holistic review.
Can you tell us more about Asian Americans relating to affirmative action? Now we understand what the affirmative action and holistic reviews are, and then it seems affirmative action is a more complex issue when considering Asian Americans. Methods of Asian penalty or model minority or racial mascoting. It's a lot of new terminology I actually heard relating to Asian Americans. So can you tell us about more Asian Americans and then share your perspectives and shed a light on affirmative action and Asian American?
Yeah, I think that's very complicated question, and basically the question of my academic research career.
This is a really big question. I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. It's a great question. And I think that it's very complicated to think about race in the United States to begin with. And then I think to then add in groups like Asian Americans becomes even more complicated, because I think, as I said, the history of affirmative action came out of the civil rights movement, which was very much led by African Americans. So there is this dynamic of conflict between African Americans and whites in this country, and so the inequalities between whites and African Americans. And so then the civil rights movement was primarily in the 60s, partly because of the civil rights movement. Bans on immigration for Asians started to go away, particularly with the Immigration Act in 1965, which many believe was a direct result of the civil rights movement questioning racial discrimination, because up until 1965, the immigration laws in the United States were very anti-Asian. You know, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, you had the 1924 Immigration Act that was highly racist against anyone who wasn't white, and really emerged out of an anti-Asian animus. And so I'm very personally thankful to the civil rights movement, because my family wouldn't be here. You and I would not be here probably if it was not for the Black-led civil rights movement. And so I always remember that as a very important historical context for why I'm here, number one. And so this is important context, but then because after 65, you started having an increase of the Latinx population, the Asian American population, which then complicates, I think, the racial terrain and dynamics of the United States. And so that's all background where affirmative action, I think, we often have in mind Black access to college. But the thing is, because the civil rights movement was so expansive, everyone benefited. Because prior to the 1960s, Asian Americans weren't having a whole lot of access to these, highly selective universities and colleges either. So because of affirmative action, that really started opening the doors for Asian Americans in higher education, Latinos in higher education, Native Americans, African Americans, so on and so forth, women, especially women, white women. And so when it comes specifically to Asian Americans, over time, I think that Asian Americans have their standardized test scores, the SAT scores, have been relatively on average very high. And I want to emphasize on average, right? Because we have a lot of within group difference and inequalities where a lot of different Asians are not, your perfect test scorer.
Right.
I'm one of them.
It's a very huge diverse group.
Huge diversity that really needs to be underscored. And so it's hard to talk about but then you walk around some campuses like the one we're at, U of I, right? You walk around, it's like, wow, there seems to be a lot of Asians, but, who are these Asians? What are their backgrounds? What are their stories? Are we getting to know them, who they are? So there's this perception, I think, that, all Asian Americans are so academically successful. They don't need help,
overrepresented,
right? And then you couple that with the mythology around what affirmative action is, and people think that it's a quota, it's a preference, so then we have to make sure that somehow that there's this myth that affirmative action is about balancing the racial demographics on campuses, and again, that is not true. And so all of these things, I think generally we don't know how to talk about Asian Americans and race, makes it very difficult, makes it very confusing about affirmative action, but specifically when it comes to Asian Americans, how they feel about affirmative action, I think that you'll get a range. I think there's a growing divide among Asian Americans around this issue, but public opinion polling continues to show that as a group on the whole, Asian Americans across ethnic groups, with the exception of Chinese Americans today, Asian Americans on the whole, the majority still support affirmative action. And for your listeners, you can look up aapidata.com and you can see this opinion polling across time. Until about I want to say 2014-15, even Chinese Americans were supportive of affirmative action. But since then, there have been several dynamics and factors that have contributed toward the decline of support among Chinese Americans. But even then, Chinese Americans are just one group among all the Asian Americans. And so still, Asian Americans on the whole support affirmative action. But I think mainstream media has picked up on a lot of Chinese American activism against affirmative action, and it seems very odd, I think, to the general public's eye to see essentially a racial minority protesting against a policy that is for racial justice and equity. So I think that kind of juxtaposition or paradox is very appealing to the mainstream media. And so it becomes very confusing and difficult to talk about in the public. And I think among Asian Americans and among most people in the general society, there's all these myths about how affirmative action works and how college admissions works, and assumptions, well, if Asians are scoring so high on these tests, why aren't they getting in at higher numbers? But that assumes that admissions is all about these test scores, and it isn't, and it shouldn't be about just the test scores.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I read a report called Asian Americans and Race-Conscious Admissions, Understanding the Conservative Opposition's Strategy of Misinformation, Intimidation, and Racial Divisions, written by you and your colleague, and then also an amicus brief in support of Harvard University. Could you highlight some of the findings from this brief and your research?
Yeah, so I'll take them separately.
Okay,
so I'll start out with the report out of the UCLA Civil Rights Project that Liliana Garces and I co-authored. And in that report, like you said, Asian Americans and Race-Conscious Admissions, Understanding the Conservative Opposition's Strategy of Misinformation. Very long title. Intimidation and Racial Division. We kind of traced the history of Asian Americans in affirmative action. So I mentioned how in the 1980s there were racial quotas against Asian Americans that were illegally practiced in certain universities. And so we talk about that history. And so there is that real, I think, community memory of that discriminatory case. But what's interesting is that even though in the 1980s Asian Americans were saying, hey, universities, you're discriminating against us as Asian Americans in favor of white applicants, what ended up happening was anti-affirmative action activists who were white, they picked up on that and actually said, oh, Asian Americans are being harmed by affirmative action. Remember now, this is one of my mentors that was very active in this case. And he was like, we never said we were against affirmative action because what was going on, the anti-Asian quotas, that is not... Anti-Asian quotas is not affirmative action. But somehow, I think these conservative activists decided to twist the story and make it look really bad for affirmative action. And they started using racial stereotypes of all these racial minority groups to put this story out there that affirmative action was somehow racist against people of color. So they would say like, oh, the stereotype of Asians being so academically qualified and Black and Latino and Native American students being unqualified. That affirmative action was somehow letting these unqualified Black, Latino, and Native American students in, and these poor Asian Americans get left out. In that story, the white interest is conveniently left out. So they realize that pitting our groups against each other then allows white dominance to continue.
Their privilege.
The privilege, exactly. And so we talk about that in our report. We also talk about how in the past, like in the 80s, Asian Americans were like, hey, we're not against affirmative action. Stop using us as a racial mascot. So white anti-affirmative action activists were essentially using stereotypes of Asian Americans to say, I'm not racist. I'm looking out for Asian Americans. But that's a fake story, right? So in that case, there's a term called racial mascotting where Asians are used as a mascot to fight affirmative action, even though we support affirmative action. And so it's a very insidious racial tactic. And so we talk about that, but more recently, as I mentioned, Chinese American support has declined. And so that's what we talk about in this report as well, and that there's kind of 4 reasons that we've identified that suggest why.
There are very different dynamics in there, including the immigration generations are different in terms of the Chinese and how they are also using social media, right? That was a really interesting part of the report. What advice can you give us about how to engage in an affirmative action conversation for faculty and students, in particular Asian American students? Like as you mentioned, as an Asian American students, it was a very complicated feeling when the affirmative actions conversation brought up. So do you have any advice? And also we discussed about the holistic admissions too, but has a holistic admissions aided the affirmative action debate? How?
I think starting with like the question, has holistic admissions aided affirmative action debate? I think it's important to recognize, like I mentioned, that affirmative action in college admissions today is in fact race-conscious holistic admissions because of the various court cases clarifying how race can be considered as a factor. And so these are, it's the same thing, right?
One of the factors.
So race is one of the factors. But most people don't understand what holistic review is. And it's hard to get away from this idea that admissions is like, oh, you get so many points somehow for high GPA and high SAT scores and so on and so forth. But it doesn't work like that. It's not so rigid because it's about the whole story and evaluating the whole story for various criteria and qualities that colleges are looking for. Depending on the college, there's whole different stuff that they're looking for. So maybe it has kind of made it more confusing because most people don't understand how holistic review works. I think that the advice about engaging in a conversation, I actually have a book chapter in a textbook on sociology of race, and there's a chapter in there where I have an activity where it's an interactive, because based on my previous experiences and my research on how admissions works, there's an activity in that book chapter that helps people pretend that they're an admissions committee. And there's kind of short, very brief profiles of different kind of fake students that then you can break up your classroom into small groups, and each small group is a different kind of college, and they come up with their mission statement, like who are they as a college, then they have to figure out, okay, what kind of qualities are we looking for based on our mission statement? Okay. And then, okay, based on our mission statement, what is our admissions rubric, right? How are we going to evaluate each applicant that comes our way? And then once the small group comes up with those criteria and their rubric, then the activity gives them fake profiles of students to evaluate and pick from. So then I think that actually helps to, because so few people understand what holistic review is, it's an activity to help people actually understand a little bit about, oh, that's what holistic review is. It's very difficult when you get stories of students where, actually 2 of those fake students are students that I remember reading as an admissions reader. So how do you figure out if you have 2 students or 5 students who have very relatively similar academic profiles? You know, some of them had more access to more rigorous curriculum, but didn't take the hardest curriculum in their school possible. Whereas other students who attended schools with less resources and less rigorous curriculum available, they took everything they could, went above and beyond, maybe even went to the community college down the street to take extra courses and worked 35 hours a week, right? And just all of these things, those numbers you realize of test scores and GPA, like, what do they really mean? You know, what are we looking for? What's interesting is whenever I do this activity, almost every group always wants to go with the student who has just done above and beyond. But then I always point out this student didn't take the most rigorous curriculum, has a slightly lower SAT score, has a slightly lower GPA than this other student. Why did you pick one over the other? So I think it allows for a more complicated conversation to understand holistic review. And each of the students has different kind of ethnic and gender identities and class identities that then allows for like a complicated understanding of diversity as well. So that's one way.
Could you repeat the book title and then your book chapter title?
Yeah, so the book is called Getting Real About Race by Stephanie McClure and Charisse Harris. They were the editors. And then my chapter is called, quote, I had a friend who had worse scores than me and he got into a better college, end quote. The legal and social realities of the college admissions process.
Okay, that's also another long,
very long
title, but that would be, I think that the activities you mentioned, I think that's really helpful. And then also I learned that having a conversation with evidence is so important rather than relying on just my gut or, my feeling or what I heard. But we never know where I heard from what. So I think that's a very important for especially faculty and students.
Yeah, I hope so. That's why I wrote the chapter.
Yeah, well, as we close, what call to action or advice would you share with our listeners in terms of increasing access and broadening participation via affirmative action in higher education?
So I always feel like you said, it's important to know the evidence and the research. So when I think about that, I feel like a very easy thing that higher education can do, and maybe it's not so easy, I really feel like it should be easy, is to stop relying on these tests, like the SAT and the GRE, when all the research tells us for so long that these tests really don't mean a whole lot. And I think this is at the heart of all of these affirmative action debates, is the assumption, anti-affirmative action advocates, they assume that these test scores mean a lot when it comes to so-called academic merit. But that's not what the research tells us. That's not even what the College Board tells us. And they sell and make money on the SAT. And so if research and evidence tells us that we don't really know a whole lot about a student based on their test scores, but what we do know is that these test scores represent significant economic, racial, gender inequalities, why do we rely on something so faulty that simply then perpetuates, I think, the inequalities that we see? And that's the scary thing, is when we think about what exactly Ed Bloom and other anti-affirmative action advocates are really fighting for. They really want these tests to be the end-all, be-all, the tests and the grades. And we know tests and grades are not very reliable. I'm not a quantitative scholar, so
Yes.
but right, so these are all
Right.
quantitative statistical studies that show the lack of reliability for predicting academic performance in
Right.
college.
There's no perfect measurement. There's no perfect scale, and
And this scale is really bad.
right, right.
Really
Yeah.
bad, but is really good at predicting inequality by demographic categories. Why do we use it so much? So that's, I feel like it's a baseless, it's an evidence-less practice. And so, that's my thing is drop the test. And one last thing, I know one thing that people always bring up is the Espenshade studies. So Thomas Espenshade was a sociologist at Princeton. You know where I'm going.
Yes,
and
I know
everyone's
it, yeah.
always like, his study says that
Right.
Asians have to score hundreds of points more than white applicants and other students of color to get into the same schools. For so many reasons, it's wrong.
Yes.
Right? Because and even Thomas Espenshade has said many times to publicly that his study does not demonstrate an anti-Asian bias because methodologically, the data sets that he used was from the 1990s. This is well before the practice of holistic review. So his model does not reflect holistic review and how colleges practice review of individual applicant as a whole package. And so it was a different time, a different practice, and than we have today, number one. Number two, he only accounted for a handful of variables. But we know in college admissions there's many, many variables.
Right.
So he couldn't account for the hundreds of variables. And so he acknowledges that in his limitations.
Right. It's just analysis. It's
Right. His analysis
Yeah.
is not conclusive.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, I think that, quite frankly, so what?
Yeah.
So Asians, on average, as a whole group, have higher test scores. But again, we go back to how admissions actually operates. And nobody gets admitted just based on test scores alone. And still, even with that in mind, Asian Americans at Harvard make up over 23% of their undergraduate students. So clearly, you've got
Right.
you've got a lot of Asian American students who are still getting in. And a lot of them are not the perfect test score takers. Actually, they bring really interesting stories and bring a lot of different qualities
Right.
and characteristics to campus. And so that's why they get in. Places like Harvard, they get 40,000 plus applications, and out of that pool, they have over 3,000 perfect scores.
Wow.
And they're only letting in 1,600 students. So you could admit several classes of perfect scores, but that's not the criteria. That's not holistic review. That also doesn't respect the applicants as actual human beings. If we only use test scores and GPA, we dehumanize people.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
my
It's-
thing. Drop the test.
I mean, it's because it's another myth of merit. We don't have discussed what really truly merit means and what does that mean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Question what that is.
Yes, and then what the numbers tells, and then as a quantitative research, I always have doubts on these numbers. It's really totally up to how we interpret it.
Interpretation
Yeah.
is everything. And even if you want to say Espenshade's study is wonderful and it does tell us something, okay, here's something that no one talks about in the Espenshade study. He found that low-income Asian Americans benefit from race-conscious admissions, but nobody talks about that.
Right.
So which one is which
Yeah.
finding do you want to go with? Like, why only one finding
Right.
without context? Right.
That's why I guess, we really greatly appreciate you sharing your research and your perspectives and sharing the evidence about affirmative action research and the issues. So we greatly appreciate you.
Thank you so much. This
Thank
was
you.
fun.
Thank you.
Tune in next month when Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher at OCCRL talks with Dr. Estella Mara Bensaman about reclaiming the racial justice meaning of the term equity. Dr. Bensaman is a professor of higher education in the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California.